The three-row SUV segment is filled with vehicles built on front-wheel drive architecture because that's the sensible way to balance family space and cost. Mazda looked at that and built this, a longitudinal turbo inline-six rear-biased all-wheel drive and double wishbone front suspension. That's premium brand hardware hiding under a mainstream badge. Good was never really the question here. The question is whether Mazda built a driver's SUV for a segment that usually asks for a nicer appliance. The real story with this engine is how it pulls. Makes 340 horsepower on premium, 319 if you cheap out at the gas pump. Peak torque of 369 pounds from 2,000 to 4,500 RPM, and that's a torque curve so flat that you could set a drink on it. There's a turbo somewhere doing its job invisibly, and this engine never lunges or surges. It gathers all 4,900 pounds of CX-90 and moves it down the road like a good portion of that curb weight was just a rounding error. And yes, Mazda put an inline-six in a three-row family SUV, and I think it was because it was the right thing to do. An inline-six is inherently mechanically balanced better than a traditional V6, and you hear and feel that difference anytime you're asking for some acceleration. This one just kind of smooths out as engine speed increases, and unfortunately the exhaust note is a bit on the muted side. Mazda doesn't do any of that synthetic sound system based engine sound fakery, and it's the right call. Under load, this engine sounds purposeful and completely competent, which is unlike most of the segment. The 8-speed automatic has no torque converter. Mazda gave that job to the mild hybrid electric motor and a wet multi-plate clutch. From a dead stop, there's half a beat, then a mechanical shrug when that clutch decides to get all 4,900 pounds moving from a stop. Once it's rolling, it behaves properly, and unlike torque converter, this whole setup feels like it was engineered by people who assumed you would appreciate the explanation. This all-wheel drive system is rear biased, and in fact it starts up in rear drive and only engages the front axle when necessary. That in itself explains how this CX-90 moves. Exiting a corner, putting the power down, that rear axle takes the load first. The front axle just does its job, which is to make sure this CX-90 goes where you're pointing it. We all know that crossovers and SUVs add all-wheel drive as a bit of a winter weather insurance policy, but here it's part of the fundamental dynamic philosophy, which is to say that this CX-90 mostly behaves like it's rear-wheel drive. The stop-start system leans on the mild hybrid electric motor, and it does announce itself at every traffic light. It's a bit like a butler clearing his throat before every sentence. Subscribers get notified when new episodes drop on this channel. Everyone else leaves it to the algorithm. And if you want to find out when our next episode hits YouTube, well, that's what the subscribe button does. Steering is one of the highlights for a couple of different reasons, and maybe not what you're expecting. It builds effort as you dial in some lock and load that front axle into a corner instead of dumping on more assist the second you turn in. Steering ratio is proper for the segment. It's a bit on the slow side. It is not sports car quick, even though there is some MX-5 DNA here, which we'll talk about shortly. And I appreciate why there's not a quick rack in here, because something a little bit quicker would make this a little bit nervous at highway speeds. There's one great characteristic to this steering system because of that inline-six architecture, and there's a lot of articulation here. So turning radius is relatively short on this thing, making parking lot adventures a breeze and three-point turns on back roads a snap. What it doesn't do is feed your palms a running report as to what's going on at those two front contact patches. Nothing in this class does, but it tells you enough, and it never lies to you about what's happening at that front axle. The brake pedal has that sports car-like firmness character to it that feels expensive, especially the first time you use it, and then after that feels slightly antisocial, especially when you have passengers on board. Initial bite is immediate, which I really like, but what it did require is a little bit of a recalibration innovation in terms of the way I engage the brake pedal and bringing this to a smooth, complete stop. Lean on the brakes at speed and you got all the confidence in the world that these brakes are going to do their job. I never found any fade whatsoever. And the brake pedal is so precise, I can control the attitude of this big 3-row SUV on corner entry. Even in emergency braking situations, one inadvertent, one deliberately for the camera here, the brake pedal gives you all the confidence. What they have filtered out is a lot of that ABS pulsation that you typically get in a full ABS stop. The last thing I will say about this brake pedal is that I'm pretty sure it was tuned by somebody who enjoys driving, but then probably forgot that families also have to park. That MX-5 DNA is here in the form of Kinematic Posture Control, and what it actually does is when you're cornering, it grabs the inside rear brake to keep the attitude of this CX-90 in the corners relatively flat. The cool part is you never really feel it working. The only thing you do recognize is that this tall 3-row SUV has limited body roll. And a big 3-row SUV like this should get a bit confused in directional changes, but this one corners relatively flat even when you're going from one corner to the next and is generally unbothered by the whole experience. The rear drive architecture takes care of the rest. It's just the right way to do things. Put power down through the rear axle, use the front to steer. And that's the difference with this CX-90. When you're hustling it in the corners, it's perfectly happy to respond to you as the driver, carve a perfect line, when much of the competitive set would be excited to understeer all the way through the apex. However, the ride, my friends, is where this platform is sending some invoices. On smooth pavement like this, damping is perfect. We're planted and the long wheelbase just helps smooth out the ride. When the road surface falls apart, as it does frequently in the Toronto area, these 21s run at a sidewall and start reporting every crack and broken bit of pavement with the diligence of someone on your HOA who has too much time on their hands. Mazda calibrated the suspension for the driver and then put your entire family on 21s, and rest assured they'll be briefed accordingly. If you'd like to support the channel beyond just watching, the link to the merch store is here, and your support there means more time for us to produce episodes like this, little less time worrying about industry access. No pressure, just an option. You're in the driver's seat, you're sitting behind a hood long enough to host a press conference. It's the byproduct of that inline 6 and the rear drive architecture of the CX-90. Seating position is exactly what you'd expect for a full-size SUV. You're seated high off the ground, but once you're here, you've got a fantastic interface to this Mazda. The steering wheel is the right shape and right size. Mazda just knows how to do cockpits properly. I've got a great relationship to the steering wheel and to the pedals, and the seat is a wonderful blend of comfort and support. Forward visibility is excellent. Rearward visibility is assisted by these large outboard mirrors. If you're the shoulder checking type, you're not going to like that situation because there are multiple pillars running all the way down the back of this CX-90, but you shouldn't be shoulder checking anyway. Adjust your mirrors properly and blind spots aren't real. The other annoying thing that I discovered as soon as I got in this CX-90 is if the third row headrests are in their upright position, you can barely see out that rear window. And when it comes to parking lot adventures, you're driving it from the driver's seat and trusting the cameras with the rest of it. The screen is a touchscreen technically, but the moment you shift out of park, it is no longer a touchscreen and you have to interface through it through this controller. On one hand, the far side of the screen is perhaps a bit too far to reach from the driver's seat. On the other hand, this positioning of the screen may be purely a design choice for that reason. Still, you got to deal with the rotary controller, and I'm pretty sure the internet called these rotary controllers a crime back in 2017, but I'm sure there's plenty of evidence to suggest that a rotary controller is a safer way to interface with an infotainment system when you're hurtling down the freeway at 75 miles an hour. Physical climate controls were spared the culling and have not migrated to the screen screen, which is a lovely thing. I don't think the temperature controls are perfectly designed. I'm sure they make sense to somebody, but you push down to lower the temperature and you also push down to raise the temperature. On the other hand, I'm the kind of computer user that sets his trackpad to scroll the opposite way of most people. There is a heads-up display, and with my polarized sunglasses and that set to maximum brightness, really can't see it right now. The instrument cluster, however, is all digital. That is very clear, very legible. One of the things I do appreciate is the consistent use of fonts in Mazda's aesthetic here, and it's absolutely lovely. Also, they don't bury the tachometer under some kind of submenu. No matter which screen setting you've got it on, it is prominently displayed, and they haven't forgotten that this big three-row SUV is powered by an internal combustion engine. Here inside the cabin, the material choices, the design, fit and finish, and even the way the doors close all suit SUV that might cost $20,000 or $30,000 more than this does. The Napa leather is lovely. The contrasting piping and stitching is a nice touch, very, very tasteful. But what's more important is that all of the buttons, switches, and dials are properly damped and properly weighted. I think what we're seeing here is the culmination of Mazda's work over the last decade plus to turn out interiors that consistently punch way above the badge. And this interior might be the clearest argument on that subject to date, right up until you realize what a comparably equipped German rival would cost and realize that Mazda undercut it on purpose. As much as the architecture of this CX-90 is intended to satisfy drivers like us, it's in here when this architecture walks in with a very detailed itemized invoice. The inline six, the rear drive packaging, all take up space that a SUV with a transversely mounted powertrain would give right back to the passengers. That's not to say the front row is spacious, because it is, plenty of headroom. Second row is as well, but it's in the third row and the back of this CX-90 where all of this lovely rear drive architecture comes at a cost. With the third row up, there's barely enough space for a week's worth of groceries for a three-row SUV family, and that's only if that three-row SUV family eats with restraint. Fold all of the seats flat, which I did once during my week with the CX-90, and it's literally cavernous in here. But this third row exists the same way a jump seat exists on a commercial airliner, technically with some consequences. Mazda chose this driver-first architecture, which is the right thing to do, but it's that third row that has to begrudgingly acknowledge it. If this video gave you more info than a brochure or a press release, hit like. It tells YouTube to share this episode with other people like you interested in an episode like this. Takes just a second. Now for the part a week-long test never reveals, the Mazda that stays after I take the cameras home. Let's start with the clutch pack transmission. Owners spent the first model year describing how the low-speed shift is anything from clunky to alarming, and Mazda has been quietly reflashing the software ever since. And it seems to have worked on 2025 and 2026 cars. The lurch is barely there, although cold weather can bring back a little of that original personality, because especially here in Canada, we apparently needed a reminder. Then the steering, the system that I love so much here, has 2024 owners complaining. Some owners reported that it would go notchy and sticky at speed, refusing to self-center through a corner. Mazda recalled it with a fix, but that's not this 2026 model, but it is one of the first questions I'd ask about a used 2024. If you're shopping used, one reliability note might change the way you shop, because some early hybrid batteries would fail. Some before 20,000 miles on the clock, with replacements back-ordered for months. The clean break is the build date, not the model year. Check the forums, open the door, read the door jam, and do not let the listing do the thinking for you. Then the small stuff owners learned the hard way. Factory tires can be gone in as little as 20,000 miles, and if you drive the way I do, that's likely the case. Then there's the i-stop that forgets it was ever switched off, and after a month, owners are hitting that button with the same muscle memory as a start switch. None of this is a deal breaker, it's just what transparency costs. Mazda built something unusually mechanical for this class, and mechanical things have habits. If you own one one of these or have some quality seat time behind the wheel of one of these, let me know in the comments what I got right and what I got wrong, because real-world owner experiences are much more valuable than anything I can learn in a week-long press loan, and I always read those comments. So, wrong SUV for the segment. It drives better than almost anything carrying 3 rows, and that was never in doubt. Mazda just answered a question this class rarely asks. Buyers here mostly want space and a machine that vanishes into the routine. The CX-90 wants to be driven and spent its packaging budget on a chassis instead of a 3rd row. Every choice that makes it engaging makes it a slightly worse appliance. Buy this if you appreciate how an SUV responds on the drive home, and if you resent SUVs that treat you like freight. This was built for a driver who got promoted into family and refuses to drive something numb. Skip it if you measure a 3-row by cargo volume and rear seat acreage, because the obvious crossover buyer will find the Mazda's stubbornness baffling and the ride busy. It's a narrow audience to be sure, but Mazda does a good job of finding that customer. Mazda built a driver's SUV and then priced it like a sensible one. The sensible buyer won't understand it, and the driver can't believe his luck. At this price, it buys engineering that most luxury brands charge more for, and it's the kind of engineering that most 3-row SUV buyers never even think they want. The CX-90 earns the wrong SUV label by being too good at the wrong job. Mazda built a driver's SUV for a class that usually rewards a vehicle that completely disappears into the background of family transportation. If you care about steering response and how a vehicle moves underneath you, this CX-90 makes a lot of sense. If you just need maximum 3-row rationality, this CX-90 might frustrate you. It's coherent on its own terms, but probably wrong for yours. And you're simply not the person who Mazda was hoping would walk into the store. Every compromise here is part of the same invoice, just itemized differently. Ride, space, drivetrain manners, and a chassis that Mazda refused to make ordinary. That's the CX-90. Subscribe if you want to see more episodes like this. Don't if you don't. Comments are open if you disagree. And the merch store link is here if you want to help fund more of these. See you on the next one.